It began quietly, a cough, a fever. Then suddenly, entire barracks of young men were collapsing under the weight of a strange and violent illness. It was 1918, and as World War I raged across continents, a new and far more insidious threat was preparing to sweep across the globe, not with guns or bombs, but with invisible particles carried in a sneeze, a breath, a whisper. It would become the deadliest pandemic in modern history. And yet, more than a century later, the origins of the Spanish flu remain one of medicine's greatest mysteries. Despite its name, the Spanish flu didn't actually come from Spain. In fact, that's one of the first great misconceptions about the pandemic. Spain, being neutral during World War I, had no censorship on its press. When the flu started making headlines there, the world took notice. Other countries embroiled in war and eager to keep morale high kept their outbreaks under wraps. Spain, appearing to be the only country talking about it, unfairly became the face of the pandemic. But where did it really begin? Some researchers trace its roots to a remote corner of Kansas. In March 1918, at Camp Funston, now part of Fort Riley, an army cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary with flu-like symptoms. Within hours, over 100 of his fellow soldiers were sick. Within days, the number ballooned. Men who had never left the Midwest were suddenly struck down by a disease they couldn't explain. And then, just as swiftly, the illness began traveling with the troops as they shipped out for Europe. That's one theory. But it's not the only one. Others argue that the virus may have emerged in the trenches of northern France, where conditions were perfect for the mutation and spread of disease. Millions of soldiers crammed into unsanitary dugouts, surrounded by rats, mud, and human waste. The air was thick with mustard gas and smoke. Bodies were weakened, immune systems compromised. It was a perfect breeding ground. British military hospitals in France were among the first to report outbreaks in early 1918. Was the virus already lurking there, mutating into something more deadly? Then there's the Chinese labor theory, less discussed, more controversial, but equally compelling. During the war, thousands of Chinese laborers were transported to Europe by the British and French governments to serve behind the lines, digging trenches, unloading supplies, and burying the dead. Some historians believe the virus may have traveled with them, from rural China to Europe, and then beyond. This idea gained traction when studies found that a mysterious respiratory illness had struck parts of China in 1917, with symptoms eerily similar to those of the 1918 flu. So which theory is true? The short answer is, no one knows for sure. The Spanish flu, or H1N1 as it's known today, didn't leave behind a clear path. It didn't announce itself with a single, undeniable outbreak. It crept in under the noise of a world already consumed by war and chaos. What made it especially strange, what confused doctors at the time, was how it killed. Traditional flu viruses tend to hit the very young and the very old the hardest. But this one was different. It disproportionately struck down healthy young adults, men and women in their prime. Soldiers, nurses, factory workers. People who should have been strong enough to fight it off. Instead, they were the ones dying in droves. Autopsies revealed lungs that had turned a deep, inky blue, filled with fluid and blood. Many victims suffocated within hours of their first symptoms. And then there was its speed. The flu spread with terrifying efficiency. Troop movements, overcrowded cities, and poor public health infrastructure turned every ship and train into a potential coffin. It circled the globe in waves. The first wave, in the spring of 1918, was bad but not catastrophic. It wasn't until the fall that the virus mutated into a much more lethal form. That second wave, between September and November, was when the mass death really began. It spared no one. In some towns, entire families were wiped out within days. Morgues overflowed, coffins ran out. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. By the time it was over in 1919, The Spanish flu had infected an estimated 500 million people, roughly 1/3 of the global population at the time. Death estimates range from 50 million to as high as 100 million. That's more than the total deaths from both world wars combined. And yet, despite this staggering toll, the pandemic quickly faded from public memory. There were no monuments erected, no commemorative stamps, no annual days of remembrance. Why? Part of the answer lies in timing. The war ended in November 1918, just as the second wave of the flu was peaking. People were exhausted. They wanted to celebrate victory, not mourn yet another tragedy. The flu, with its invisible enemy and chaotic spread, was harder to understand and therefore easier to forget. It didn't fit into the neat narrative of good versus evil that the war provided. And then there's the strange fact that, for decades, science didn't fully understand what caused the Spanish flu. The virus was so small, so elusive, that it wasn't until the 1930s that researchers even identified influenza as a virus, not a bacterium. The original virus strain remained a mystery until the late 1990s, when scientists recovered preserved tissue samples from victims buried in the Alaskan permafrost. Using those samples, they were able to reconstruct the 1918 virus and confirm it as a strain of H1N1, one that likely originated in birds before jumping to humans. But that still doesn't solve the question of where it first emerged. What we do know is this: the Spanish flu changed the course of history. It reshaped demographics, devastated communities, and influenced everything from public health policy to literature. It taught the world how quickly a virus can upend civilization, and how unprepared we often are to face such threats. In many ways, the lessons of 1918 are still being learned today. We may never know exactly where the Spanish flu came from. Kansas? France? China? Somewhere else entirely? It's possible the answer is lost to time. But what remains is a haunting reminder. Sometimes, the deadliest threats don't announce themselves with a bang. Sometimes, they arrive on the breath of a stranger, in the cough of a friend, hidden in plain sight. And when they do, the world changes forever.